St. Thomas Institute, we have talked so much about the Summa Theologiae of St. Thomas Aquinas, this magnum opus, this compendium of Catholic theology produced by St. Thomas Aquinas. But one might argue that the first Summa ever written was by St. Paul, and it's an epistle to the church in Rome, the epistle to the Romans. So we're going to look at several elements of Romans in several videos, but today I wanted to go through the outline of the epistle to the Romans and look at it as St. Paul's Summa. St. Paul's epistle to the Romans is, besides the four Gospels, the most cited and the most commented upon book of the New Testament. What is its context? Well, it was likely written in the city of Corinth, and there are a few clues inside Romans that tell us that Paul is in fact sitting in Corinth when he writes the epistle to the Romans through his scribe Tertius. The first one is that 1st and 2nd Corinthians reveal that Paul used Corinth as his home base for his missionary work while in Greece, and this makes sense because Corinth was the major port city. Secondly, in Romans 16:23, Paul mentions Gaius as his host. And Gaius, we learn from 1 Corinthians 1:14, lives in Corinth. So this is where Paul is staying, in Corinth, the home of Gaius. And then also Paul mentions in Romans 6:23, the same verse, Erastus. And Erastus was the city commissioner. In Greek, he is the oikonomenos. He is the one who's in charge of the city. This is where, by the way, we get the word ecumenical. He's likely the city treasurer, and he lives in Corinth, as we learn from 2 Timothy 4:20. So all of these clues put together confirm that Paul is sitting at a desk in Corinth with Tertius, producing this great Summa, the epistle to the Romans. What's the date? Well, Paul wrote this epistle after Claudius expelled all the Jews from Rome. That happened from AD 49 to 54. The emperor said, hey, all Jews, you're kicked out of Rome. You can't live in Rome. By the way, he did that because the Jews were fighting over someone named Chrestus, Chrestus, and all historians identify that Chrestus as Christ. So the Jews were already fighting and debating over Jesus Christ, and this is the reason secular historians tell us that the Jews were expelled from 49 to 54. And so Paul is writing about Jews coming back to Rome and mixing again with Gentile Christians. And we'll see that in the second half of Romans, Paul discussing that unusual situation of Jewish Christians remixing with Gentile Christians there in Rome. He also writes in Romans that he was about to go unto Jerusalem to minister unto the saints. That's in Romans 15:25. And so this places Romans at the close of his second missionary visit to Greece. And scholars place this between the winter of AD 55 and 56 or the winter of AD 56-57. And so all this makes sense because if the Jews began to re-enter Rome after the death of Claudius in AD 54, then the date of a winter of 55-56 or even 56 and 57 is a perfect fit. So I think we can safely say that Romans is written about AD 55. Now let's look at the outline of Romans. Again, this is Paul's great Summa. He begins in the first few verses with just a greeting to the church of Rome. And I think Paul decided to write his magnum opus to the church in Rome because the church of Rome is the new capital of Christianity. The book of Acts under Luke shows us that the gospel center moves from Jerusalem and then to Antioch and then finally to Rome. The book of Revelation also shows us that the old Jerusalem passes away and that the church assumes the kingdom of the Gentiles, which is the Roman Empire, prophesied in the prophet Daniel, and becomes a new Jerusalem with a new capital in the pagan capital, which is Rome. Now, the next 8 chapters, Paul focuses on the doctrine of justification and human sin. He begins by condemning idolatry and how it's against nature. This is in chapter 1. And then in the second part of chapter 1, he condemns male and female homosexuality. He says that working against nature and worshiping nature in the form of idolatry leads to a corruption of our sexual nature, and this leads to both male homosexuality and female homosexuality. That's his argument in chapter 1. And remember, he's writing a Gentile audience. Ancient Rome was full of orgies, bathhouses, male and female homosexuality. And then when he moves to chapter 2, he talks about how all of our consciences judge us. Even non-Israelites, even Gentiles live by their conscience, and when they sin, they condemn themselves. And then he looks at Jews who have the law of Moses. He says, even more so are the Jews guilty of the law because they know the law, and yet they do not fulfill the law. And then he has this famous quote in chapter 3 where he says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And he says, look, it doesn't matter if you're Jewish, it doesn't matter if you're Gentile, if you're human, you have sinned and you've fallen short of the glory of God. You're short of the perfection of God. And then that's the bad news. Then he announces the good news. And he says, God's righteousness is imparted to us through faith, namely faith in Jesus Christ. And he shows how Abraham, who's the father of all the Israelites, the father of the Jews, was justified not by law, not by Torah, not by circumcision. He was justified by faith, by believing in God's promises. And in chapter 5, he talks about how all of us are condemned in Adam, and all of us can be justified through Christ through faith. And by the way, these are all the passages that Martin Luther and the Protestant reformers used to teach justification by faith alone. But as you read all 8 chapters, you'll never see the word alone once. Paul never uses faith alone. He uses justified by faith. That's the language of Paul. That's the language of the Catholic Church. In chapter 6, he focuses on baptism and how justification frees us from the dominion of sin. And then in chapter 7, he talks about how we are freed from our flesh through union with Christ, that by being united with Christ, we can say no to sin as baptized Christians. And then chapter 8, he talks about how we are able to defeat sin and the flesh, and God gives us his divine sonship. We become sons in the Son of God. We become sons and daughters of God the Father in and through Jesus Christ, and this is our greatest dignity as Christians. So that's the first part there on justification. The next part is condemnation and salvation of Israel. And so Paul now turns his attention and says, well, what about the Jews? What about Israel? Did God give up on them? Did God fail when he chose people and they turned against Christ? And it seems that most of the Jews never did become Christians. Why is that? And so he says that the Jewish people in chapter 9, they had unbelief. They lacked faith. And this is something that he says the Jews struggled with from the very beginning, when they made the golden calf, when they turned to idols, when they turned to Moloch, when they turned to the Ashtoreth poles, when they turned to the Baals in the Old Testament. It's always been a temptation for Israel. And he says in chapter 10 that Israel's rejection of God's promise leads to the reception of God's promise by the Gentiles, by the nations, and that this is somehow part of God's providential plan. But in chapter 11, he says, hey, don't give up. God's promises are not revocable. There is a remnant of Israel, and there will be a final restoration of all Israel. This is in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It's in the Church Fathers. It's in Thomas Aquinas. Before the end, during the time of the Antichrist, all Israel, all Jews, will have faith in Christ and be part of the Catholic Church before the very end. And then the fourth section is about moral conduct between Jews and Gentiles. Chapter 12 is living in unity and having mercy for all men. Chapter 13 is, hey, we need to obey Roman authorities, even evil authorities like Nero. He doesn't mention Nero, but Nero is the emperor at this time. And then he talks about how we must love our neighbor and love all men. There's called the universal mercy right here in Romans 13. And then in 14 and 15, he says, hey, there's weaker brethren among you, Jewish Christians, who think they have to eat kosher food, who think they have to observe the new moons and the Jewish holidays. And Paul says, hey, you know what? They're wrong. They don't have to do that. They certainly shouldn't make you do it. But if you are a stronger brother or sister in your faith, don't judge them, don't destroy their faith, don't ridicule them, and don't make them stumble. If you invite them to your house, don't serve a pork sandwich. And if you go to their house, eat kosher. Don't destroy one another's faith over trivial matters. So we can see here that the Jews are coming back to Rome, and Gentile Christians are having a problem assimilating these new Jewish brothers and sisters who believe in Christ there in the city of Rome. Paul wraps up with a summary of his missionary work to the Gentiles, his desire to visit Rome himself, and then finally his personal greetings and a final benediction. So there's the outline of Paul's great Summa, his epistle to the Romans. In the next lesson, we're going to look at the Roman road of salvation. We're going to focus on those chapters from 3 to 7, even into 8, and look at Paul's doctrine of justification in depth, and also show how you as a Christian can share the story of salvation to people around you who aren't Christians or maybe who aren't Catholic. You can show them the great joy we have as Christians with faith in Christ and how justification works for every single human person. Thanks for being a member of the New St. Thomas Institute. We'll see you in the next lesson.